is the Investor Connect podcast program. This is Hilty Martin. I'm the host of the show, in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, private equity, family offices, and many other investor groups for startups and growth companies. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for joining us. Well, hello, this is Paul March with Investor Connect. Today we're here with Laura Hilty, who is a principal at Healt Ventures, a venture capital firm focused on digital health and healthcare technology, as well as Chief Strategy Officer at Ignite Data, portfolio company of Healt Ventures. She has a strong background in healthcare, clinical research, corporate strategy, product development, and partnerships. Her work involves evaluating and supporting early-stage health tech startups that aim to solve important challenges in the healthcare system. Laura helps connect innovation, technology, and investment to improve how healthcare is delivered, managed, and accessed. Overall, she plays an important role in identifying promising healthcare companies and helping them grow into impactful solutions. Well, thank you for joining us, Laura.
Thanks for having me.
Well, great. Well, looking forward to learning more about what you're doing here today. And so let's talk about your background and how you got to this point.
Yeah, definitely a bit of a winding path, but it's been a really fun journey. So started my career at Epic, an electronic medical records company back in the day, which is what brought me here to Madison, Wisconsin. I was there for a few years, implementing in large health systems, and then joined a 30-ish person startup back in 2010 within the clinical research, within what we call pharma tech now, within the venture side. And I ended up establishing the product management function there and launched 7 new software products. So we kind of take it from nothing concept to revenue and then hand it off and go launch the next one, which was taught me a lot about starting new things and launching new things, which, becomes relevant later on. I helped the company exit and we sold to a strategic acquirer where I did corporate strategy, helped put the two very different companies together, as well as the go forward corporate strategy plan. And we then acquired 6 companies in 18 months to execute on that. So that's what got me into investing initially, is from a strategic acquisition perspective. And then before I left, we sold to Blackstone for $5 billion. So over that kind of 13 years, got to see all of the different iterations from kind of almost nothing all the way to a larger company. And I quickly realized that I prefer the faster pace than a $5 billion company. So that's when I moved to Healt Ventures, where I have been working as an early stage health tech investor with VC firm, also based here in Madison, working with startups and kind of a small but mighty operation as well within the VC side. I recently took an operating role, as well as mentioned, at one of our portfolio companies as well. So it's fun to have a lot of the variety. But I think what landed me in venture capital, I think, was kind of a mix of some of the launch of what does it take for, to identify product market fit and actually go after it and, listen to your customers. And then from the investing, the evaluation side, as well as some of the exit side of things, because, there is always, once you invest, you always have a time where you want to exit as well. So kind of a good combination that I've really enjoyed.
That's great. Well, you've seen the evolution of digital health over the years. And where is Healt Ventures seeing the greatest opportunities today?
It's really interesting how it's changed over the last couple of years as well. With Healt Ventures, actually, a lot of us are former operators for, having worked in companies, and a lot of them early stage and raised capital ourselves, but a lot of us came from Epic. So that not only helps us understand not just the technology, but kind of the inner workings of what that means for health systems and kind of how they think and the decisions they have to go through, the bureaucracy they have to go through to make new decisions. And for the longest time, we had a large focus of knowing how to sell in enterprise health systems and how to work well with Epic. With the last few years, especially the last year, Epic has announced a lot that they are doing themselves within AI. And we've seen a couple examples where they have, had partnerships that they have backed away from. So now it's an interesting time within digital health investing because, if you're basically investing in a company, you don't want to be bulldozed by Epic. So kind of understanding, I feel like this is a big thing for me as an investor, is understanding how the buyers buy and what they actually need. And I think that's becoming clear, is if Epic can do something and it's sufficient, they would prefer to work with, Epic with the enterprise system as opposed to a startup on the smaller end. And so with that, it's introduced a lot of risk into digital health investing if you don't know kind of where Epic is going and where you don't. So I think that is certainly a huge shift in just the last year in digital health investing.
Well, big companies like to do everything, but we also know big companies don't always execute very well. Do you
Yep.
foresee any opportunities for nimble startups to take over when it doesn't work out the way they thought it did?
Yeah, I think it's a really great point and great question. So there's a couple of things. I think one is understanding what Epic is in their core focus that they could do well versus what, is just either not going to be a focus or it's too deep where they couldn't do well. In either case, Epic tends to announce a couple of years ahead of what they actually do. That does tend to freeze the market. So for a startup, if you're already in there and Epic announced it, eventually the health system might realize Epic isn't really doing it the way that they need it to, but then that's potentially 3 years down the line and the startup might be done by then. They might have already died their death because of that. So I think some of that is just getting over that, staying alive until that happens, which there's plenty of examples where where that's been the case. I think for startups who are starting now and looking at, or even investors looking at, where do we invest now? The areas that are very expert level, like you need to go really deep in a certain niche in a certain area, but it does require, Epic integration or integration. I think those are much safer. And then especially anything that's coupled with something that Epic won't do, like Epic won't be a device company and Epic won't be staffing clinicians for, they're not going to compete with their health systems. So they're not going to be clinicians. So that's where it's kind of interesting that tech-enabled services almost becomes more interesting now than it has in the past. Because if you can get your secret sauce to be something that Epic won't replicate, then you've kind of created a bit more of a moat than you needed to in the past.
Great. Well, let's talk about some of the key trends shaping healthcare innovation today. The FDA announced they're moving to real-time clinical trials, and they want to do the trials instead of pharma. What are we seeing there?
Yeah, so this is kind of tapping into, I think I've been 17 years now in pharma tech or in the R&D space, clinical research space. There's a lot happening with the FDA right now, and they made this announcement where, like you said, they're real-time clinical trials. They had an RFI, so basically a request for comments, and they made this big announcement with the goal of expediting the process and the review process. What's interesting is they're basically saying that they want to take a lot of the work from pharma and do it themselves by getting real-time information. And there are a lot of questions around how that actually works because typically the FDA does not get participant level information. So how do you get the real-time information if you're not participant level? So there's, some speculation in some companies that are, well positioned to be kind of in the mix there to be able to support that. Shortly after the announcement, there were several of the top FDA people involved in that either were asked to leave or they left. So it does leave the question of what's still on the table and what is this going to look like. It does, based on rumblings, seem like there's, still progress being made and, some evaluation on what that actually means. Hence the RFI is their early innings of how they're really going to have this play out. For me, I think the one thing that really does make sense in my mind is safety information. If they can get safety information right away, that makes sense that that's in the FDA's purview. The rest seems interesting that pharma would even want them to do that because there's a lot of interim analysis and amendments that can be made to studies to look at certain cohorts and kind of make sure that there is some part of the trial that's successful. And if you kind of take that away, then I'm not sure if pharma's in as much control as they should be. And FDA tends to have delayed timelines. So it'll be really interesting to see how that all plays out. But I think one of the things where the portfolio company that I'm part of is unleashing EHR data and being able to send it to a a pharmaceutical sponsor, to like electronic data capture systems. And here it's interesting because we could just as easily point it to the FDA and whatever their system of choice will be. And that's much more real time than usually the month delay that typically they would get today into, based on manual data entry sorts of things. So I think there are some of these things that are really exciting from a lot of perspectives. And then there's a lot of question marks on like, how exactly is this going to play out? So, I can see little pockets of like definitely the, adverse events information, the serious adverse events information should probably be flagged to the FDA immediately. And, there's probably a lot of alignment on that from a regulatory perspective. But everything else I think is yet to be determined. So definitely an interesting time to be in this space though.
Great. Well, let's shift gears for a moment. Let's talk about, there's a shortage of physicians out there today. What does that mean for the future of work in healthcare? How are we going to solve that?
Yeah. That is a great question. It's interesting because this isn't new. There's been a clinician shortage for several years, but it's still not getting better. So from a VC perspective, we see a lot of different angles to this. And everything from staffing to just make it easier to hire somebody, which feels like a good thing, a necessary thing, but almost a band-aid approach. Some of the ways, so there's, I think, not a single silver bullet side of this. Some of the ways that we're seeing the innovations come across are one is just automating the administrative pieces to take those off of clinicians to, basically have them operate at at the top of their license. So they're not sending emails. This is something, even back to Epic. Epic is doing like my chart drafts of, messages so that they can just review everything that AI has drafted up and they can just, more quickly actually send the emails back to patients as an example. There's others that are interesting for like one of our portfolio companies is offering peer support for people going through recovery. And that basically they're able to offer peer support immediately. So that kind of takes some of the more immediacy away from, some of the behavioral health and, therapists and all of the clinicians that are needed to support from that perspective, not to replace them by any means, but for the in the moment, support. It's really coming down to peer support. It's Sober Sidekick is the name of the company. And they're able to predict a relapse with 92% accuracy, which then allows you to prioritize when the clinicians or when, they reach out to avoid ER visits. So then all of a sudden you're starting to impact the workload on the actual hospitals and ERs because you're able to prevent it through peer support where you don't need clinicians to support that. So it's kind of creative ways of trying to figure out how to address the problems earlier upstream in ways that don't necessarily require specialist visits, for example, so that you can kind of prioritize across the board.
Great. Well, let's talk about your travels through $0 to $5 billion exit in the scaling of a healthcare technology company. What lessons did you take from that?
So there are very different lessons at each of those stages. I have a big passion around the early stages because I think that is where companies make really key decisions that make scaling either a major strategic issue or more of a blocking and tackling scaling issue. So the more that you can nail product market fit before you start scaling, the easier the scaling is going to be. It's always going to be hard. There's always lessons learned on how to scale. But if you're starting off on a weak foundation and you don't know what your product market fit is, then scaling along the way is going to be building the plane while you're trying to fly it. Which is always the case in any startup. It always feels like that. But the more that you can nail it up front, the more scaling lessons learned are blocking and tackling type of lessons that a lot of people, can do. So from the earliest stages, product market fit, I tend to separate it into discovery phase and sales phase. And for investing, this is where I think the angel investing piece is really interesting, is the more that you can prove that customers actually, that your customer, your actual buyer, that the person has an urgent and pervasive need to solve their problem that you're looking to solve, and that have proof points that they're willing to part with their money to get a solution that you're offering to go solve that problem. The more proof points that you have around that, even if it's not repeatable revenue yet, that is a much more solid foundation for building a business and scaling it. I usually recommend getting as far along as you can before getting VC investment. So getting all of that proof point as much as you can before VC investing. And so oftentimes I will recommend, if they really need funding to go build the thing or even build prototypes, to look for strategic angel investing. So those who have connections in the industry and can almost help with that product market fit alongside of them building that out and building up the use case and identifying what is the actual problem we're solving and what is the full solution that they need in order to build it. Once they have that, VC funding becomes a lot easier to build once you have those proof points kind of built in.
Well, so how does HealthX Ventures evaluate founders in the healthcare sectors? What do you guys look for?
In founders,
Yeah.
it is a very subjective thing to look at founders, because a lot of people say, have they had successful exits before? And sometimes that's not an indicator. You learn a lot regardless if you were successful or not. You learn a lot the first time that you build a company. So I think there is definitely something to be said about experience from that perspective. I tend to look at both character of there's a tension and a nuance to basically having both conviction and enough humility to actually listen. And those two things sometimes seem like they're completely at odds with each other, but that is where founders who can do both and hold both at the same time, those are the ones who know how to run the company. They know how to pivot based on what they're seeing in the market, based on what their customers are asking, but they're not too swayed by customers asking things. They have a vision and can actually go with it, but can, know the nuances of understanding the difference. Sometimes that's hard to vet out because they're basically in sales pitch mode. So some of this is, back channeling to who has worked under them before, who's worked over them, and trying to get out, some of the personality. I guess the other thing that I try to look for is the founder's passion and understanding of the problem that they're trying to solve. So if I understand that this is the problem that they're on this earth to go solve, and they're not going to stop at anything until they find and solve it, that's the conviction that I want to see. And if they're fascinated by the problem and they know all of the nuances, solutions, they'll figure out a solution. If you're trying to you see a big market and you want to go after the market, but you don't understand the intricacies or passion about the problems that you're solving, then I think that that's where it becomes too easy to just chase after shiny objects and kind of get swayed by things that aren't important, or give up.
Right. Well, so what's your advice for early stage healthcare founders seeking investment in today's market? What do you tell them to do and what do you tell them not to do?
Well, today's market is very interesting. Like I said before, I usually recommend getting as far along as possible before taking VC investment, which is a luxury that not everybody has. With how easy it is to spin up new technology with AI, I think that piece is really important to understand, not only who the competitors are today, but who the potential competitors could be, and figure out what your moat really is. Assuming that there's going to be 5 more AI companies in the next couple of months being able to actually spin up a technology that you're about to do. So being really clear and intentional about what moat you're creating, because first mover advantage is usually not an advantage. So there's some of that. Then, if you create a network and it's super sticky, that can be an advantage, but oftentimes it's, you're the one creating the market, and that's, it takes longer to get up to speed and get customers. So I think just being really clear about what your moat is and getting as many proof points as you can about product market fit and willingness to pay. Obviously, recurring revenue is ideal. That's, any investor will understand that, but the more proof points that there's actually something there and conviction behind the customers is good for investment, but also as a founder, you don't want to get The reason for that is you don't want to get stuck into an expectation of getting, because once you get VC investment, the expectation is basically hockey stick growth. And so unless the founders really are at that point, then it's painful if they're not at that point and they're getting that pressure and expectation before you have product market fit. So that's why I would say, like, get as much of that under your belt before you actually take investment.
That's great advice. Well, in the last few minutes that we have here, what else should we cover that we haven't?
I will say other advice in terms of fundraising, especially right now. People have talked about an AI bubble. I feel strongly we are not in an AI bubble. AI will not go away. I think we are in an AI valuation bubble, though. The valuations on AI companies is all over the map. And advice for founders is to not get swayed by really frothy valuations too early. At exit, when you're exiting your company, go for as high a valuation as you want. That's when you get paid out. But if you take too high a valuation too soon, then you're backing yourself into a corner that in the next time, assuming that you do need to raise again, you're risking a down round, which limits all of the momentum. And it makes your investors not happy. There are a lot of unhappy people at down rounds, and it kind of blocks your momentum. There's a lot of question marks. You can do it, and a lot of times it is the smart thing to do, but it is much more ideal to take a lower valuation and then continue to build on that momentum, even if it's a smaller step up in the future. I think the one difference with that is if you feel strongly like you'll never have to raise again, then obviously it's, you basically, if you're in it for the long haul until the exit, then you can assume that you'll work into a frothy valuation over time. And you don't, if time is on your side, then that's where it makes a little bit difference. But I think too many founders are too focused on the super frothy valuations that are available right now. They don't think a couple steps ahead about what those implications are for what they would need for revenue wise, and what they actually would need in order to not kill the momentum in their company.
Great. Well, so how best for listeners to get back in touch with you?
Probably my LinkedIn page is the best kind of central place. So feel free to post or message on there.
Great. We'll put your contact details in the show notes. I want to thank you for joining us today and hope you have you back for a follow-up soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Hilty Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.